By the way, you wouldn't know it because he's a Norwegian. Norwegians are genetically challenged. They never talk about themselves. I like to talk about them. It's a good one. The Open Market Committee is one of the few public service bodies in this country, in fact, in the world, where members come together in the span of just a few hours. They present their positions without fear of political retribution and without posturing for the cameras. We hammer out an agreement of course of action based solely on what we consider to be what is judicious for the long-term health of the economy. My job is to represent the 27 million people in my district, but also to keep in context that we're not there to make short-term decisions, we're there to make long-term decisions for the benefit of our country. And usually by noon on the afternoon in which we conclude our discussion, we'll start sometimes at 8, sometimes at 8:30. We craft a statement for public release explaining the actions that we've taken. And then we release a lengthy set of minutes of our deliberation 3 weeks after the meeting. If you really want to get a view of monetary policy, I would urge you to read through if you can stay awake, to read through those meetings minutes. So here's the point. The Open Market Committee is where we as Texans and parts of Louisiana and New Mexico that we cover have a voice at the policy-making table for the most powerful and essential central bank in the world. The President of the United States appoints and the Senate confirms the governors, Chairman Bernanke and the other governors of the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve System. The 12 Federal Reserve bankers like me, who sit side by side with those governors in making monetary policy, are not subject to that political process. We're hired and fired by 9-member boards, as I mentioned, of directors that represent the financial institutions and stakeholders and economic diversity of our respective districts. I want to make this point clear before I talk about policy. I'm not accountable to any Washington Politico, Democrat or Republican, executive branch, or member of Congress. I am politically neutered. I'm proud of it. And devoutly nonpartisan. And I've guided solely by what I believe is the best way to craft policy in order to encourage what we are mandated to do, which is to achieve employment growth with price stability, regardless of who's in the White House or who's in the Congress. And my fellow bank president and I represent Main Street, not Washington, not the Wall Street establishment. And I want you to know that every time I speak or intervene in the policy process, which being a Texan is quite frequently, I do so very much with that in mind. So now let's talk about where we're going. I'll tell you a little story here. There was a great Nobel Prize-winning economist named Kenneth Arrow. And during World War II, he served as a weather officer in the U.S. Army Air Force. And he worked with individuals who were charged with the particularly difficult task of producing month-ahead weather forecasts for the General Command. Well, as Ken Arrow and his team reviewed these predictions, they confirmed statistically, because he was an economist by training, what you and I could have easily guessed ahead of time. That is that the weather forecasts were not more accurate than a random roll of dice. So understandably, the forecasters asked to be relieved of this seemingly useless duty. And Ken Arrow's recollection of his superior's response was priceless. Here's the note he got back. Quote, "The commanding general is well aware that the forecasts are no good. However, he needs them for planning purposes." I want you to keep with a grain of salt what I'm about to say. My forecast of the economy. And by the way, it doesn't just have to be a month ahead. One of my favorite stories of all is even in terms of what's happened in the immediate past term. Many of you may remember that great headline when Governor Dewey thought he had been elected President of the United States, and Harry Truman had actually beaten him. The story is that as they went to bed with that headline, and Dewey turned to his wife and said, "How's it going to feel to sleep with the President of the United States tomorrow night?" The next morning at breakfast, she looked at him and said, "Am I going to Washington, or is Harry Truman coming to our house?" Let's keep that in mind. We went through a crisis. It was a horrific crisis. You can blame whomever you want how we got there. Bad regulation, over-regulation, interest rates held too low too long, whatever your excuse is, I'm a central banker. It has been the duty of central banks to step into the breach when things go wrong. The system failed when Lehman Brothers went down, and everything cascaded from that. Nobody trusted anybody else. No money was being lent from the bank. The commercial paper markets failed. The money market mutual funds broke the buck. Every financial instrument that we depend on, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, ground to a halt. We had a crisis. The playbook for a central banker was written in the early 1820s by a name named Walter Bagehot. And we opened the sluice gates. We were not responsible to regulate Lehman Brothers. We were not responsible for Bear Stearns. We did not regulate and supervise AIG. But the system crashed. And so we put together a panoply of programs in order to restore those operating markets so that commerce could be conducted, because commerce ran to a halt. They worked. And in fact, you're looking at one of the few agents of government who actually makes money for the taxpayer. We made well over $100 billion in 2 years, and we paid it back to the United States Treasury, and then we closed those programs down. So imagine that. A government agency that actually first does what they say they're going to do, unimaginable. Secondly, they work, unthinkable. And thirdly, they make money out of it for the taxpayer. I think that's a pretty good record. Now we are stuck with a very large balance sheet. In normal times, your central bank, the Federal Reserve, has a collective balance sheet of the 12 Federal Reserve banks of about a little shy of $900 billion. We now have on our balance sheet over $2.7 trillion. We have a little shy of $1 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. We have been purchasing an awful lot of treasuries, even though I voted against that program, or excuse me, I argued against it. I didn't have the vote, which is a rotating vote, and I wasn't in favor. We cut interest rates to zero, with all the associated costs and pain that that takes, because it takes something out of the hide of the small saver, and it also is not the best thing for our community and our regional bankers. But we felt that the biggest danger was a Great Depression, which none of us wanted to go to again, and a Great Deflation, which we staved off. And the economy bottomed, started to claw its way back. Did pretty impressively well at the very beginning. And I think, and I have argued from the inception, and in fact, those of you that want to note it can go back to a mid-2009 piece in the Dallas Morning News, that the recession was over, the risk of deflation was no longer, that it would be a long slog and a slow crawl to correct for the problems that had been created that put us in the bad spot in the first place. And indeed, that's what's happening. This first half of this year, we've seen slow economic growth. We've seen very little employment growth, although employment rates have come down. And here I'm talking about the nation, not the blessed part of the nation, which we call Texas, and I'll get to that shortly. I would say, looking forward, asking you to bear in mind that economic forecasts are nothing but forecasts. That the second half of this year will be much stronger than the first half will prove to be. And it wouldn't be unimaginable to me to see 4% growth in real economic terms adjusted to inflation in the second half of this year. Why? Because some of the disruptions that held things back are passing through the system. There's no question that the price of energy and the price of food has frightened the consumer, who is still getting over traumatic shock syndrome from the setback that we had. As these prices come down a little bit, as we forecast they would, and they've come down fairly significantly, particularly on the energy side recently, we see that the gas pump, they're still high, but they're coming down. That relieves a little bit of the anxiety. In terms of the setback that affected many regions, from the tsunami in Japan, the Japanese were way ahead of schedule in terms of replacing, and meanwhile people were drawing down on inventory. What they call the donut hole is passing through a little bit faster than many people expected. But still, we have a basic imbalance in the United States. We consume too much, and yet we're driven by consumption. I like to say that Americans will buy anything that looks good, feels good, whether it is good or is not good, that smells good, that they like. 70% of our economy is driven by consumption. And we have enjoyed a period, historically, that allowed us to buy things for much less, with less price pressure, and with greater production worldwide than we had ever enjoyed before. Why? Because we won. We won the Cold War. The bamboo curtain came down. I like to remind people when they complain that we spent an entire generation of blood and treasure to defeat the Soviet Union, to protect ourselves against Mao. When I was in college, but for the grace of the draft lottery, my classmates, including my best friend, went to Vietnam to be killed. Now we trade with Vietnam. In fact, they sell their bonds in our marketplace, and we invest in Vietnam. This is a good thing. This is good news. We won, but now we have to compete. Fortunately, we have other markets to sell into. Our own consumption exceeded our capacity to finance our consumption. And if you're looking for a resurrection of that consumption, it's going to take a great deal of growth in employment and more confidence to build consumption domestically. And the way we make up for that gap is the great exports that are sent out of the ports in Texas and elsewhere into a world that is growing, and yet we have to be competitive with the rest of the world. That gets back to the whole issue of education. How do we drive a high value-added society unless we have the best education in the world? And we got a lot of work to do on that, and we're going to have to figure out a way to square the corner from a budget standpoint in order to get higher education as well as primary and secondary education to be first rate from a worldwide standpoint.